Imagine it's 1920 and you hear that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution has passed. Women are crying and people are celebrating in the streets. Imagine going to a polling station and casting your ballot, knowing how hard your foremothers had fought to give you that right. Now, imagine the same thing again. It's 1920 and you hear that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution has passed and everyone is celebrating in the streets, but you still can't vote. We commonly finish the story of women's suffrage in 1920, but the truth is that many women and entire communities were still excluded from voting even after the 19th Amendment passed. Do you know who they were? Do you know how this could happen in our country? Stick with me. In just a few minutes, you'll have a much more complete story about 3 groups of Americans who were excluded from voting rights. First, Indigenous Americans. Some people wonder whether to use the term American Indian, Indian, Native American, Native, or Indigenous. According to the Museum of the American Indian, all of those terms are acceptable, but Native people prefer to be called by their specific tribal name whenever possible. Also, always be aware of endonyms, which means within name, as in what you call yourself, versus exonyms, which means outside names, as in what other people call you. For example, I grew up hearing the term Iroquois to describe a large group of indigenous peoples on the east coast of the United States. But Iroquois was the name that the French gave to them. Their endonym, what they call themselves, is Haudenosaunee, and we'll pick up our story with them. The Haudenosaunee people of the eastern United States were an extremely egalitarian people, so much so that when English colonizers arrived, they studied the Haudenosaunee Confederation and copied it when they formed the Confederation of the original 13 colonies. The original framers of the Constitution, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, were admirers of the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. And those founding fathers used principles from the Great Law of Peace in the US Constitution. There were some differences, though. The Haudenosaunee governing body includes clan mothers as well as male chiefs. Just take a second to consider the irony that the original inhabitants of this land already had a system where people were regarded as being equal with inalienable rights, where women had a voice. And then the colonizers came in and copied their ideas, but excluded all women and the Native Americans from whom they had gotten those egalitarian ideas from the new Constitution and prohibited them from voting. In 1920, no Native people of any gender were allowed to vote because they weren't citizens of the United States. This is a complicated issue because there was a lot of disagreement among Native peoples about whether they wanted to be citizens of a country that continued to persecute them. Many indigenous nations wanted the US government to recognize their groups as distinct sovereign countries like Canada or Mexico. And so, of course, then they wouldn't vote in US elections. But they wondered, would the US really honor their sovereignty? They didn't know. And if the US didn't end up respecting their sovereignty, then they would be residents of the United States and would definitely need voting rights. Can you see how tricky this would be? Let's showcase just one of the countless amazing Indigenous women who fought for the right to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin was Métis, Turtle Mountain Chippewa, born in North Dakota in 1863. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt appointed Marie as a clerk in the Office of Indian Affairs. It was the height of the boarding school years when Indian children were taken from their families and purposely stripped of their customs and their language. The adage at the time was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." Imagine Marie arriving in Washington, D.C. in this context, getting a government job with a bunch of white men. You might expect her to dress in a power suit so she could prove her competence and hang with the boys. But look at this picture from 1911. This was the official photo for her government personnel file, and she chose to wear her native dress and braid her hair. In 1912, she enrolled at the Washington College of Law. That means that she started law school when she was 49 years old, taking night classes while she kept her day job. When she graduated as an attorney, she became the first woman of color to graduate from Washington College of Law and the first female Native American lawyer in the United States. She became active with the suffrage movement in Washington, D.C., and marched with other women lawyers in the 1913 suffrage parade. And a word about that parade. It was the iconic Women's March when Northern white organizers caved to Southern pressure to segregate the parade, and Ida B. Wells defied their instructions to march in the back. Remember that? Well, those same parade organizers had suggested that Bottineau Baldwin should create a float on a mythical Native American theme. She chose instead to march as a modern Indigenous woman, very much alive and very much not mythical. So what ended up happening? The Indian Citizenship Act passed in 1924. It gave Native people citizenship, but it did not guarantee the vote. Voting rights were decided state by state, with most states excluding Native populations from voting. For example, Utah was the second state to allow women to vote, but the last state to allow Indigenous people to vote. Voting wasn't allowed on Utah reservations until 1957. That's my parents' lifetime, and Indigenous voting continues to be suppressed. For example, many reservations don't have traditional street addresses recognized by the U.S. Postal Service. And ballot drop boxes, polling places, and election offices are sometimes located hundreds of miles away from reservations. This is not right. Every single American should have easy access to civic participation. So please check out some organizations that address these problems at the end of this video and get involved. Okay, another group who could not vote even after the 19th Amendment was passed was Asian Americans. Just like Native women, Asian American women helped win suffrage in 1920, but were not yet allowed to vote. This was due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. From the beginning of the 19th century, Asian immigrants had been coming to the United States, performing essential labor like building the Transcontinental Railroad. But in 1870, the citizenship of naturalized Asian Americans was revoked in the Naturalization Act. That meant that people who had already legally acquired citizenship and were here in America building critical infrastructure for the country had their citizenship taken away. Then, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Asian American citizenship and any immigration from China. This meant that Asian Americans, some of whom had lived and worked here for their entire lives, lost all their citizenship rights. And of all those revoked rights, voting has got to be the worst to lose because it leaves you powerless to change the system that's oppressing you. So let's talk about one of the inspiring women who fought these policies, Dr. Mabel Ping-Hua Lee. Lee was born in China and immigrated to New York City with her parents when she was a child. Even as a teenager, Lee was an activist for women's rights. In 1912, a lot of famous suffragists were leading a women's march of 10,000 people in New York. Mabel was only 15 years old, but she was selected to ride on horseback next to the legendary Anna Howard Shaw. Later, she received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Barnard College, which is the sister college of Columbia University. And in 1921, she got a PhD in economics from Columbia, becoming the first Chinese woman in the United States to earn a doctorate in economics. Lee was working on her PhD when the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, but she was still unable to vote due to her status as a Chinese immigrant. She would not gain the right to vote until the passage of the Magnuson Act in 1943. And despite her work securing the vote for white American women, it's unknown if she herself ever gained citizenship or ever voted. Now let's talk about Black women. Remember Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the debate over who should get the vote first, Black men or white women? Well, starting in the mid-1860s, a series of 3 Reconstruction amendments were passed. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. And then in 1868, the 14th Amendment gave Black Americans citizenship, allowing formerly enslaved men to vote. But racist voter suppression was so bad in some states that they needed another amendment. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which prohibited the federal government and states from denying citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These three amendments should have guaranteed Black Americans voting rights, right? I mean, they should have. But if you've ever taken a US history class, you'll know that after Reconstruction, there was a terrible backlash, which led to white supremacists establishing Jim Crow laws. These laws not only segregated society, they also denied Black Americans basic civil rights, including their constitutional right to vote. There were all kinds of measures designed to stop Black people from voting. Poll taxes that they knew would be way too expensive for most Black citizens, extremely difficult literacy tests, and absurd and insulting tests like, and I'm not kidding about this, how many seeds were in a watermelon or how many jelly beans were in a jar. And if that didn't work, then they used outright violence to punish and intimidate voters. So who were some Black women working for voting rights? There were so many, but today we're going to learn about Fannie Lou Hamer. And here to tell us her story is scholar and Brown University professor Keisha N Blain.
Fannie Lou Hamer was a civil rights activist, a disabled Black woman from Mississippi. She was born in 1917. She was the youngest of 20 children, grew up as a sharecropper. She is someone that I think every American needs to know. It was in August 1962 that Fannie Lou Hamer attended a mass meeting in which for the first time she learned about her constitutional right to vote as a citizen of the United States. She couldn't believe it. She set out to let the whole world know. And she thrust herself fully into the movement. Fannie Lou Hamer, in August of 1962, attempts to register to vote for the first time. She is stopped. This was a Black woman who had a sixth grade education, and she was being asked a very specific question about the state constitution, of all things, and she did not know the answers. This was a strategy to block her and to block others from voting. We know about the violence, all of the strategies that white supremacists were employing to keep Black people from the ballot box. Another pivotal moment for her, and that's 1963 in Winona, Mississippi. Hamer is traveling with a group of activists. They had just organized a voters registration workshop, and they're traveling back home, and they stop in Winona. It's a rest stop. You know, some folks have to use the restroom, other people want to grab a bite to eat. And Hamer once again experiences brutal violence. I mean, Hamer is sitting on the bus looking out and seeing her friend being arrested by police officers and not knowing what's going on. She gets off of the bus just to inquire, and within minutes, a police officer starts kicking her. She's on the ground. She's arrested along with several activists, and they're taken to a Winona prison cell. And in that prison cell, the beatings continue. There's also a sexual assault that takes place in that prison cell. These are the things that she's talking about in August 1964 before a national audience.
My name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave?
This speech that she gave electrified the nation. No one knew about Mrs. Hamer until she gave this speech. And in this speech, she talks as bold as ever, telling people, this is what I went through, and this is what Black people are facing in this country. Why? Again, what is the crime that has been committed? Oh, the crime of trying to register people to vote. Rights that we're supposed to have as citizens of the United States. I mean, I think how much the odds were against her in that sense, and how much courage one needed to have pushed back. If we open up ourselves to listening to her, we could in fact be transformed the same way so many others were transformed when they encountered her.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blain. So, next time you celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment, and you should, just remember that not all women got the right to vote in 1920. Also remember that voter suppression continues to be a huge issue for communities of color. As an American, I believe deeply in our country's stated values that all men, meaning all human beings, are created equal, and that this American experiment depends on a just democracy where everyone has one equal, sacred vote. So make sure you're registered to vote, and then please make sure that everyone in your community is supported in their right to vote as well. This is our obligation as Americans and as a human family. As Fannie Lou Hamer herself said, nobody's free until everybody's free. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and share this video. Please vote and check out these organizations that support voting rights.